On Monday morning, what gets you out of bed? For many people, the answer starts with, I have to. I have to get to work, I have to get to school, or I have to take my kids to school. Yet I believe all of us desire a better answer than one that starts with, I have to. Deep down, we desire to start the day with, I am meant to. This is the desire for purpose. Purpose is doing what you were meant to do and not just what you have to do. Purpose fills our life with meaning. And if you're watching this video, it probably means that you believe our highest meaning is experienced when we are filled with God's purpose. So, practically, how can your life be filled with more of God's purpose? Well, a very practical place to start is by looking at how you spend the hours that comprise your life. Take a look at this pie chart. This is based on extensive time studies done by the US government on how Americans spend an average working day. It's an average, so everyone's percentages will differ slightly. For example, some of you may sleep less or work a little more. But your life probably resembles this overall picture. Here then is the question for you. Which part of your life, if it was filled with more of God's purpose, could really make the biggest difference in your life as a whole? I think it's obvious. Having our work lives filled with more of God's purpose could be life-changing. For most of us, work defines more of our waking hours than any other part. And for most Christians, work is also the part of life that can feel most disconnected from God's purposes, at least when compared to activities like caring for others or spending time with those in our household. So, if we are desiring for more of God's purpose for our lives, we should be especially desiring God's purpose to fill our work lives. But how does this happen? How do we orient our lives so that on Monday morning we are getting out of bed to do something we were meant to do by God? Well, a key insight is to realize that when we go to work, we are adopting a distinct identity. On Monday morning, we are putting on a particular hat. It is the organization hat. 90% of Americans work for some organization, whether it's a corporation, a small business, a government agency, or a nonprofit. Even if you work from home or are an independent contractor, chances are that most of your clients are organizations. And even if you're not formally employed right now, you still work. And that work is still heavily shaped by organizations. For instance, if you're a student, your work as a student takes place within some educational institution. If you're staying at home, working as a parent, you may be a member of a school. Your kids belong to sports teams, or you're taking them to some other program run by after-school organizations. Our lives are inescapably defined by the organizations in our lives. We are organizational beings. And this means that if we want more of God's purpose to fill our lives, we need to grasp how God's purpose connects to our organization hat. And this is the ultimate goal of Redeeming Babel, to help you connect God's purposes to your organizational life. In order to strengthen the connection, I want to take you through the following topics. In this first session, we will focus on the missing piece in our desire for more purpose at work, specifically how the organization itself connects to God's purposes. In the next session, we will introduce the big idea of Redeeming Babel, that organizations are made in the image of God. For this session, we'll focus on how the internal relationships of an organization are meant to image the internal relationships of our triune God. In session 3, we'll then help you identify your organization's true purpose in the external world and how that mission reflects God's own purposes in creation. From there, we'll equip you to diagnose the ways that your organization falls short of God's purposes. We'll do so by studying a key biblical story that describes the essential nature of organizational sin. After that, we'll look at God's big plan to repair and redeem organizations, especially secular organizations. We'll see that the way that God sends Israel to be a light for the nations is a blueprint for how God sends you to your organization. Then, we'll be looking at how God may be assigning a particular role for you in His redemption plan, using the Old Testament law as an important guide. Every session in this course has one main session goal. Today's session goal is to understand what probably has been a missing link in your life. The link connecting God's purposes to your organizational life. Now, why is this link missing for so many Christians? Well, there are complex historical reasons for this weak connection. One reason has to do with the ways that Christian thinkers failed to keep up with the changing nature of work in the last couple of centuries. But the practical upshot is that you and most Christians have received very little teaching about organizational life. The people responsible for teaching you? Well, we've practically ignored the organizational hat. And I speak as someone who, unfortunately, was part of this pattern. For the first 15 years of my professional life, it was my responsibility to teach about God's purposes to people like you. In my roles as campus minister and church pastor, I gave numerous sermons, led hundreds of Bible studies, and even wrote multiple books. In all of that teaching, I almost never taught on God's purposes for organizations, especially secular organizations. I ignored the organizational hat. Instead, I and my peers concentrated exclusively on the other hats you wear in your life. We taught overwhelmingly about these hats: individual, family, friend, and church. For instance, take the fundamental message that God's purpose involves forgiveness. How did I teach people this? Well, I taught that forgiveness was first and foremost what God extended to you as an individual. The main sins involved were your individual sins, the ways that you personally have fallen from God's purposes. In the counseling work I did as campus pastor, I emphasized the need for students to forgive wounds received where? In their family of origin. In all my ministries, a core part of any teaching on community emphasized the importance of reconciliation in relationships. Between whom? Most often, between friends. And in my ministry in South Africa, I taught that God primarily intended to image forgiveness and racial reconciliation where? In the church. But throughout all of my ministry career, I never taught that Christians need to forgive their organizations. I never even explored that a corporation or a government agency might have a spiritual identity so that it could be forgiven. Do organizations need forgiveness? How do organizations sin in the first place? And what does organizational sin have to do with the redemption that God achieved in Jesus? None of these questions were ever raised by me, much less answered. Forgiveness is just one example. Try this little exercise for the next few Sunday sermons. Every time you hear a real-world illustration or application of some sermon topic, make a note about which hat is being used. I bet you will hear overwhelmingly references to the individual, family, friend, or church hats. Most likely, you'll hear little to nothing about the organization hat. The fact that we Christian teachers so completely ignored the organization is illustrated by the way that we have historically taught on the subject of work. Now, most teachers teach preciously little as it is on the subject of work. If you tallied up all of the topics preached on Sunday mornings, you would discover that only a small percentage of sermons focus primarily on work. But even in the small bits of teaching, when Christian teachers do focus on work, what is striking is that we try to do so while ignoring the very hat that defines most everyone's work lives, the organization hat. When pastors teach about work, to the little extent that they do, they rely on a body of teaching known as the faith and work movement. Historically, the faith and work movement has tried to connect God's purposes to work via a certain set of standard topics. These standard topics are vocation, work-life balance, evangelism, and excellence in ethics. Each of these standard topics correspond to one of the standard hats. In terms of vocation, the who is the individual. What were you as an individual made to do? What gives you a personal sense of joy? Or what do your unique giftings lead you to do? For work-life balance, we encourage people to not overwork. Why? So that you have more time for family. In terms of evangelism, we encourage you to share the gospel. How? Through friendships with your coworkers. Finally, we encourage Christians to be excellent and ethical in their work. Why? A commonly offered reason is so that the collective reputation of Christians, the church, will shine brightly. Now, what most faith and work teaching miss is the most defining reality about work, that we are working for organizations. Your work is defined by the organization and the purpose of that organization. Think about how you spend the majority of your work life. The team meetings you attend, the emails you answer, the budgets you produce, the projects that are assigned to you. What is the purpose of all those activities? Those activities are not meant to further your individual sense of vocation, your work-family life balance, or your friendship evangelism. And those activities are not meant for you to demonstrate how people who go to church are especially ethical or excellent. The vast majority of your actual work is meant to advance the organization. The central purpose of your work is tied to the purpose of your organization. All the other activities, such as friendship evangelism, really exist at the periphery. I'm not saying that such activities are unimportant, but those activities really make up a tiny fraction of your entire work life. Again, when we arrive at work on Monday morning, it is the organization hat that we are putting on. And this means, in order to connect our own organizational life to God's purposes, we need a missing link. We need to connect God's purposes to the organization itself. This is the big idea of Redeeming Babel. God's purposes do connect to your organization. And this is why Redeeming Babel is not going to address the topics of individual vocation, work-family life balance, or friendship evangelism. While those are valid topics, you can find teaching on that in the existing faith and work literature. We're going after that missing link between your organization and God's purposes. Make that new connection, and God's purposes can more powerfully fill your entire life. One common reason why people are closed to the idea that God has a purpose for their organization is the belief that God really only cares about explicitly Christian organizations. Christians can struggle with the idea that God has a purpose for secular organizations. The problem with this belief is that the majority of Christians actually work for secular organizations. So most Christians end up doubting that their own organization, and hence their work life, is meaningfully connected to God. In the upcoming sessions, we'll see how God's purposes absolutely include secular organizations. Secular organizations are an important, vital part of God's plan of redemption. By the end of this course, you'll be surprised at how many biblical passages describe this expansive view of God's purposes. And for many of you, grasping the importance of secular organizations to God can transform your life. I believe this because it has transformed my own life. The first 15 years of my professional life were spent in ministry, working solely within Christian organizations like campus ministries or churches. I reached a point where I realized I knew very little about the Monday to Friday world of the people I was preaching to on Sundays. I think that's a practical reason why pastors preach so little about working in secular organizations. Some of us have never experienced that life, or many have only experienced it a long time ago. I myself sense that my lack of experience in the secular world was narrowing my own picture of God's purposes in the world. So, I decided to resign from professional ministry. I still stayed a member of the church where I'd been a pastor, but I embarked on a second career in the secular world. I founded my own business, a consulting firm that serves secular nonprofits and government agencies. This experience has dramatically widened my understanding of God and His purposes in the world. It's become clear to me that God cares very much about the kinds of secular organizations that many of you work for. And as a result, I experience a level of purpose in my life today that in many ways exceeds what I felt when working just in Christian organizations. But many Christians working in secular organizations can struggle with this sense of purpose. In my experience, such Christians fall on a spectrum marked by 4 stages. The 4 stages are captive, consumer, committed, and commissioned. Each stage is defined by how someone finds purpose when putting on the organizational hat. You are a captive if instead of being filled with purpose when you put on your organizational hat, instead you feel that hat sucking purpose out of you. You experience the organization as oppressive, yet you feel like you can't escape it. Maybe you feel like you have no other options, or that the organization has some other psychically unhealthy hold on you. But you don't have any sense of purpose when you wear your organizational hat. You are a consumer if your purpose is to get something in an exchange that benefits your self-interest. You may contribute hard work and long hours, but your main motivation is that you're getting something out of it for yourself. Salary, experience, prestige. And by the way, I'm including in that definition of self-interest the interest of your own family. If you're wearing your organizational hat primarily to provide financially for your family, you are still in the consumer stage. And one sign that you're in the consumer stage is to ask, if I could get a better deal elsewhere, how quickly would I consider leaving? In my experience, the large majority of Christians are in this consumer stage. You are committed if your sense of purpose has to do with some positive qualities of the organization. You appreciate and are loyal to the organization because certain qualities are present. The appreciated qualities could be the organization's cause, its culture, your colleagues, or something else. The key about this stage is that your commitment is rooted in those qualities being present. If the organization lost those qualities, you would strongly consider leaving. You are a commissioned person if you are in that organization because of God's purposes for the organization itself. You're there not because you're trapped like a captive, and you're there for more than just a self-interested exchange like a consumer. You're there for even more than certain organizational qualities like a committed person. You're there because of God's purpose for your organization. You recognize that God has you there to participate in His purposes for the organization itself. You know how the organization matters to God, and you discern that God has assigned you a role within that organization. These are stages in a journey towards God's purpose for our organizational lives. To repeat, if you long for more of God's purposes to fill more of your life, you will long for God's purposes to connect to your organizational hat. For this connection to happen, we need a missing piece, the organization itself. This is the big takeaway for the entire Redeeming Babel course. God has a purpose for your organization. As you recognize this truth in Scripture and in your life, your purpose meter will grow, and you will begin to move closer towards commission. When that begins to happen, you will start experiencing Monday mornings differently. Those mornings won't just be about what you have to do. Those mornings will be about what you were meant to do. In the next session, we will fill out God's purpose for organizations with a biblical truth that may be new and surprising to most Christians. The idea that organizations are created in the image of God. Starting with the internal relationships within your organizations, we'll explore how your organization is actually designed to image the triune God.